The consequence of that was financial instability, and let me now explain how that worked. Okay, look at these numbers up here. Almost all of the deposits you can see are in the country banks. That's the big number there, 2,627,000,000, right? Deposit accounts. Okay. These deposits, the reserves of those country banks, are partly in notes, but mostly in deposits in other banks in the money centers. Now, what happened? The United States was an agricultural country, very much so at this time. And that meant that there was a strong cyclical character to the demand for money, the demand for notes. At crop harvesting time, the farmers would withdraw from their deposits and they needed notes, okay, in order to move the crops. And Young mentions in this article $50 million. Okay, doesn't sound like that much, okay, but just think about what happens now. Look at this chart here. Imagine that of this $2,627,000,000, $50 million is withdrawn. Okay? That requires the country banks to pull $50 million, let us say, from New York, deposits in a New York bank. Those $50 million, however, the total reserves being held by those New York banks are 221. So that's 25% of their reserves. And now they have to contract credit or they have to get more reserves from somewhere. Okay? Let me write some of this down. This is what causes the financial crisis. Seasonal instability. Okay? The country banks, the country farmers, first, withdraw $50 million in cash. Okay? From their local banks. Ultimately, that's a withdrawal. That implies withdrawal of $50 million. Oh. $50 million from New York, from New York banks. Okay. So now they are way below their 25% required reserves. So they have to replenish those reserves. And how do they do that? Calling in call loans to speculators. Okay. Young explains that the New York banks, when they had excess reserves, that is to say, when the farmers didn't need them, okay, they didn't want to just let them sit idle, so they would lend them to stockbrokers who would use them to buy stocks, to make a speculation, and they would promise to give this money back. It was like overnight loans. So they were call loans. They were overnight loans. And so, come the harvest, they would say, okay, now I need the money back, okay? And as a consequence, the speculators would have to sell whatever they had bought with that, okay, in order to come up with the money. And so there was an asset price consequences. If the speculators are selling, you see stock market, stocks fall. And interest rates rise. They also tried to raise reserves from world money markets, which meant London. Okay? Which often disrupted world gold markets, as a matter of fact. Okay. So the United States is this big child, okay, in the world monetary system, and every fall, okay, it throws a little fit. Okay, and it causes the asset market to go crazy. It causes the international gold market to go crazy. Okay, eventually Europe got sick of this. Okay, and they sent us some help, Paul Warburg. Okay, to help us create a central bank. Okay, but we did some of this on our own too. There was agitation for a central bank as well. The key moment was 1907, the financial crisis of 1907, when J.P. Morgan sort of showed us how we could get out of this crisis ourselves, okay? By creating, amongst these New York banks, all of his friends, they had a clearinghouse, and they created clearinghouse loan certificates, which were a substitute for money. So they created elastic money supply and elastic reserves, but it was all private and for their friends, okay? What the Fed did was to say, hey, that's a good idea. Let's do that for everyone and with a central bank. Now I'm going to show you how that worked.